Hey folks, welcome to yet another episode of FSUFO, Forbidden Science UFO with Michael McDonald and Chris Stiles. And today we've got a very interesting guest on our show. We have a real live, newly retired, however, RCMP officer, Royal Canadian Mounted Police, for you folks down in the lovely US of A. And Elliott Van Dusen is his name, and he's an author too. And you can get his books on Amazon. His first book was called Supernatural Encounters, True Paranormal. No, sorry, his first book is this book, Evil in Exeter. The true story of an investigation into one family's terrifying haunting where evil has no conscience. I love that subtitle very much. And that's available on Amazon.com. And then there's Supernatural Encounters, True Paranormal Accounts from Law Enforcement, which is a catchy title that's promising in terms of content and strangeness. So, Chris, so we got Elliott Van Dusen coming up in a second. How did you find
Yeah.
him?
Well, I'll tell you, I was very lucky to find him. This is an episode I've been looking forward to doing. I was just kind of hoping, and Elliot was a late booking, and it was like, yes, I have him. I've been wanting to do this because, one of the things is in my work, all my research, whether it was Shag Harbor, all the other classic cases, and even current things that come up, is I think sometimes people think that law enforcement, and Elliot, I think, will be backing me up on this, is not the kind of situation where things are always covered up or evasive. And I'd like to dispel a bit of that myth and show what it's like. My rapport in dealing with the RCMP over the years in UFO investigations has been good. And we're going to delve into some of that, some of the accomplishments, some of the policy, some of how it actually works, and what happens. Because an RCMP officer, and is usually of great interest to U.S. audiences, they're our first line of defense against the unknowns, against the paranormal. They're the man you pick up the phone and you call, particularly before the internet, and even since. If you feel threatened, if you don't know, if you're worried, they're the guys that show up and have to wing it.
Well, let's have our RCMP officers show up now. I think we got Elliott on the queue here. Hello,
Mm-hmm.
Elliott. Nice to meet you. Welcome to
Hello,
FSUFO.
hello, guys, and thanks for having me.
Oh, absolutely. Look, I'm so glad you made it. We called last night. I know it was late notice, but you're here, and we'll just jump right into it, sort of thing. You had, is it a 20-year career, would it be, with the RCMP? Must be in that range.
Close, yeah, 15. I did 15
Your
years
recent
service.
15 years. I remember the day that you were leaving us, and you've come back, and I don't know what you did through, but you're not just a retired RCMP officer, and you weren't just an RCMP officer. As Michael pointed out, you're an author, but you're also the director of the PPRI, which is, an investigative group that looks into, unlike me, all things paranormal. I was wondering perhaps if you could just tell us what that entails, what the mission is of the PPRI.
Yeah, so I created it back in 1997, and I created it as kind of an overflow from Daryl Walsh's organization, which was the Center for Parapsychological Studies in Canada, because they strictly focused on parapsychology, which is extrasensory perception, mind matter interaction or psychokinesis, and survival. So apparitions, ghosts, hauntings, and there was other things that he didn't investigate, such as UFOs and cryptids and things like that. And at the time, I had an interest in UFOs, and I ended up meeting you and meeting Stanton Friedman and Don
Mm-hmm.
Ledger as well. So it was really great to have those maritime connections. Learned a lot from you guys. But then it's funny, even though you have an organization that deals with more than just parapsychology, you seem to end up focusing on ghosts and hauntings. That seems to be what people contact you about. So that turned out to kind of be my specialty, I guess, at the end of the day. Um, but yeah, no, I did that before I joined the RCMP. Then I joined the RCMP, and I learned very quickly that you don't talk about this kind of stuff in the RCMP. I received a lot of backlash, much like my as Daryl calls him, my hero, Fox Mulder. Um, I received a lot of ridicule for what I did, so I kind of followed it and kept up with the research and still took online courses and things like that on my own time, but I didn't kind of publicly advertise that I was doing it. And then towards the end of my career, about the last 2 years, I ended up coming across that Evil and Ex-RCMP case. And at that point, I knew I only had a couple years left, and I kind of didn't care what people thought anymore. And I started coming out into the public again and doing podcasts and things like that.
So it would be fair to say that on the force, even though they're often called in on such cases, that it's discouraged to discuss it in general. Or, I mean, obviously there's privacy concerns in a specific case, but it's discouraged as something, in a general sense. Is that fair? That's what I'm getting out of your.
Yeah, it's like an example was I was brand new. I was maybe 6 months on the force, and I got called into a staff sergeant's office once before, and with my corporal, and they were asking me about my involvement with paranormal phenomena research investigation. So I explained to them, and I said, "This is what it is." I told recruiting about it, and they, because when you join the RCMP, they ask you if you're part of any groups or organizations. They're more concerned about, are you part of any criminal groups or anything like that? So I said
Hmm.
yes, and I explained, I was part of the center and I was part of PPRI, and they didn't believe me, and they ended up having to make me write a memorandum to departmental security, which is the unit that deals with your top secret security clearance. And so I wrote that letter, sent it into them, and it came back to the detachment, and they said, "Well, we already know that he's part of this organization. He told us in our interview." It was almost like they didn't believe me. And so once that came back, I was kind of upset, but I was a brand new officer, and you learn very quickly not to make waves when you're brand new. Um, so anyway, I kind of told them. I said, "Listen, guys, like, you do realize that our organization actually used to investigate UFOs." And I began explaining to them about RG-18, the record group files that are held at the
Hmm.
National Archives.
Hmm.
I explained that I had obtained RCMP files thanks to Chris, through St. Mary's University, which was actually jointly investigated, or kind of, they would seek Father Burt Gaffney's opinion on UFO sightings, and they had no
Hmm.
idea that we did any of that stuff.
Yeah.
But it was, it kind of upset me. So after that experience, I said, you know what, like, I'm just going to kind of keep this quiet. Obviously, these people are not receptive to this, and that's kind of what I did.
Anyway, you're back in the fold now without encumbrances, and we're glad you're back, right? But I had some sense that I'm a little surprised at some of what you say, because I'm going to be very kind to the force in a lot of ways. As you'll see, my experience, cooperation, I think that has been good.
Yeah,
But
absolutely.
in some cases, they've even gone above and beyond. And I can tell you, although and probably it's that you were early in your career. But the thing is, I can tell you officers that were long timers, career men, um, they're not so tight lipped. Even some of them on the force. Yeah, are you familiar with the info center that used to be on the Northwest Arm, or I don't know if it still is, in Halifax? I can remember going there and some of the officers speaking openly about their UFO investigations to me firsthand. You know,
No, I can't say I've
I
ever
could
heard of
name
that.
them.
No.
Okay. Well, maybe we'll all learn a few things, but I already have from you. I'm surprised. I knew there'd be, it's hard to pick the right word, not suppression, but some like, yeah, we don't want to shout this from the rooftops, right? But like I say, it is what it is, and my experiences have been quite positive for the most part with RCMP. You know,
I just jump in here for a second, but I'm actually an RCMP brat. My father was a staff sergeant in the force when he retired, and
that what kind of brat you are? Okay,
yeah, that's right. And
yeah.
he had some great stories, and one of them we're going to talk about. He was not involved, but knew the officer involved. So I would say, from my experience with my father and some of the other members of the force that were friends of his, that they were very open-minded people.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is funny. I mean, I've talked to other police officers. I talked to a detective down in South Florida, actually, and he had the opposite experience. If anything strange happened on a case, his police department would actually seek him out for his opinion. And But then again, then I talked to another police officer that has given me some stories for my book that comes out next week. He was with the Salem Police Department for 32 years, and he said that he absolutely would not speak about his ability. He's a medium as well, and he kept that quiet because first couple times he's mentioned it or helped out on a case with it, he received some ridicule as well. So I mean, it obviously depends on who you work with. As far as disclosure goes, I agree with Chris. I find that the RCMP is pretty good with their UFO disclosure, which
Mm-hmm.
is positive.
Yeah, contrary to popular opinion.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
mean, yeah. The thing is, you know, the RCMP is kind of a unique force in the world, unlike most police departments. You know, you guys, I go, you guys, I know you're retired, but I can't help it. You know, I look at it, you're the bounty here. Um, you know, you serve as a national police force, as a provincial police force, and often as a municipal. And that's kind of unique in the world, right? Those roles can be very different. Those loyalties and expectations can be different, you know? And of course, the force has a great reputation. You know, sometimes, you know, there's cases where people see it as being a bit tarnished, but overall, you know, it comes to mind as, you know, having high standards of professionalism and training. And, you know, I don't think most would question that. Now, the thing is, Michael, since you brought it up already about the case your father's familiar, why don't you introduce the case and I'll jump in and explain how important that case is to me, because we got lots of other good ones to talk about here, and I'd like to get.
Sure, sure.
Yeah.
I believe that this happened in the 1970s. And
76 October.
right around 77, 78, my father, I was always interested in UFOs. And there was a big flap in Ottawa in 73 over Shopper City. So um, we were talking, I was discussing UFOs, and my father, in his sort of glib way, says, well, that reminds me of an incident that happened in Sackville, Nova Scotia. And then he proceeded to tell me that an officer whose name is Farrand um, was discussing this case in or near the mess uh, in one of the detachments, detachment in HQ actually in Halifax, and he was being ribbed somewhat by some of the other members of the force as he was telling the story. But there were a couple of other members that were like, no, you got to take him seriously. And he was himself, no, this is serious. This really happened. And of course, he actually had to write it up. And so they were ribbing him of the fact that he was actually did an official investigation, ad hoc investigation. This happened. And the case basically is, as I remember, was that between the RCMP officer Farrand in his squad car, and actually, I believe it was the Halifax International Airport, which had the object on radar at points, and his discovery that two things were happening. One is that a UFO seemed to be hovering over and plaguing a house in a suburban neighborhood, um, but also the object seemed to be paying attention to Officer Ferrand himself. Is that correct, Chris?
Yeah. Well, them and the other, himself and the other witnesses, Michael. Uh, Lower Sackville's a bedroom community outside the Halifax Dartmouth area, the largest city in the province of Nova Scotia. And it was the police force there was the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. And what happened was in October of 1976, a resident in the area, and I use her name because it's included in the reports, which are in the public record. You know, there wasn't the privacy concerns that we have nowadays. And she was glad to be associated with the case, I can tell you, in follow up. Anyway, Mrs. Webster called the RCMP detachment in nearby Bedford and said, I have a UFO over my house. I was wondering if you could send an officer there. We've seen it since earlier this evening. And indeed, Constable Ferran was dispatched and went to the residence on Hillside Drive in Lower Sackville. And when he got there, he knocked on the door, and when Mrs. Webster appeared, she says, in fact, if you want to step outside and look, you have 3 UFOs over your house. These objects he described as lozenge shaped, sort of long oval thing, and they had 3 distinct sections. The middle section was like a tea strainer. You could see into it, and there was a mysterious green light moving around. There was no noise, and these things were hovering. Um, Constable Ferran stayed on the scene for 2 hours, And he stayed on the lawn. Mrs. Webster brought out coffee, and they observed this. And the officer estimated them perhaps at 500 feet. He radioed to nearby Shearwater, the base there, and Halifax International. I believe, Michael, though, the one error I think you may have made, they weren't painting anything on the radar. However, he could see them, and he radioed to other patrol cars in the distance, and they confirmed they were seeing them from other higher positions. You were going to say something there, too?
No, that you're right. That does
Yeah,
clarify
yeah,
it.
they
They
didn't
weren't
paint them.
painting it on radar. That's correct. Yeah.
No, that's right. But he was looking at him. He had his field glasses out from the trunk of the car, and they were passing them around. And like I say, this went on for 2 hours. Eventually, he leaves the scene and tells Mrs. Webster that if she feels threatened or they come closer, they appeared to be slowly gaining altitude. Call them back, and they would send either him or another car. If she felt in any way threatened or whatever. At the end of this one-page, crisp, very interesting little RCMP report, he mentions some other witnesses, which were their neighbors, the Bedfords. Well, when I found this report, and by the way, the first copy I had before I found it in Records Group 77, it was in a box of documents that Stanton Friedman had left me that he'd never gone through, that were in the basement of his home there in Fredericton. When I found this one, I really liked it. I thought, that's cool, and maybe they still live there. The phone numbers were still there. Like I say, you didn't have the Privacy Act. I stuck it on my fridge with a magnet. And I remember, if I ever get out that way, I'm going to just drop in on her unannounced and try and do some follow-up. And that's when things really changed. And I'll try to tell this as briefly as I can. This will probably be my longest story, and I really want to bounce off Elliott on this. But this is so significant, even in my career as a ufologist, because this case really gave me insight into this phenomena. This case really opened me up to the work of Jacques Vallée. I wrote some papers on it, and they're published proceedings of MUFON symposia that I attended, and it really brought things into perspective and changed my whole view of the phenomena. Let me explain why quickly. I went one day and just knocked on the door of Mrs. Webster when I was in the area, and she answered. I explained who I was, that I was an independent UFO researcher, and wanted to talk to her about her sighting that she had back in '76. And she said, "Oh, come in. I'd love to talk to you." Well, when I interviewed her, her report and what she told me, Michael, and it was just so precise to the RCMP report. There was no embellishments. I kept asking her if she'd ever seen anything since, and no, and it made me think of the standards, Elliott, and you know what they teach you guys: write what you see. Don't give opinions. Don't just write what you see. Her memory, and she said, oh, many times afterwards we thought we saw something, but no, she claimed not to have a sighting since. Kept looking, kept open. Guess we'll never be that lucky again, is the way that Mrs. Webster put it to me. And I went to depart, and when I went to depart, since there was really no new evidence there, I asked her about the neighbors because they were mentioned, and here's where the case really began to open up in a different thing that went beyond Constable Ferran's basic report. When I asked her this, she said, oh, the neighbors. It wouldn't do any good to talk to the neighbors, I don't think. And I said, why not? And she said, oh, they're part of some very strict Christian sect, she said, and we don't get along with the neighbors, she said, but I don't think they'd help you or want to take part in this. I said, well, they're mentioned in this report as an additional witness. I said, in the interest of thoroughness, I'll probably follow up. She goes, well, I think they're away, Chris. I haven't seen them in a few weeks and whatever. So I thanked her for her help. I went, knocked on the door, and indeed there was no answer. So I kept that report on the fridge, put it back with the fridge magnet, and I kept trying the number. And I think it was about 2 or 3 weeks later, a gentleman answered the phone, and I asked, is this Mr. Robert Bedford? And again, I use their names openly because these are public reports and the identities were not concealed. And I asked him, I said, were you yes, I told him who I was, identified myself, said, I'd like to ask you about the UFO sighting you had in October '76. And he says, whoa, buddy, I'm going to stop you right there. He said, UFO sighting? He said, no, I don't think I had one of them. And I'm trying to jog his memory, and he says, "Just a minute." And I hear him holler for his wife, and he screams, "Honey, dear, when did we move down from Ontario?" And she said, "The summer of '76. Yeah, he says, "Well, I guess I was there." He says, "Well, who said this?" I said, "Well, I have an RCMP report in front of me." I said, "I guess your neighbors, the Websters." And suddenly he goes, "Oh, the Websters." Well, the Websters could see anything, he said. Well, this seems to be starting to go south at first. And I said, "Well, maybe so." But I said, "However, the RCMP officer was a witness to this too, as were others in the distance from other patrol cars." And next thing you know, I can hear the wife. Obviously, they're on a landline in a hallway. And she's saying, "Dear, what is it? Who it?" "Oh," he goes, "the Webster saw something." He goes, "It's about a UFO. It was years ago when we come down here." And she says, "Dear, that was the night." I can hear her saying this. And suddenly he covers the phone and I can't hear anything for maybe 10 seconds. And he comes back line. He goes, "Oh, yes, sir. I know what you're talking about now." And then he apologizes and said, "I should not have spoke that way about the neighbors." He said, "I'm a Christian. I didn't tell them I've been warned of that." And I hope the audience doesn't read too much into that. That's not a, but he was very serious. He said, "I apologize. I shouldn't have said." He says, "You understand, we don't get along with the neighbors." So, which turned out to be a great strength in this case, by the way. And he says, "But, no," he says, "I didn't see anything." So now I'm really confused. I said, "So you're listed in an RCMP report as a witness, but you didn't see anything. How'd that work?" Well, he says, "Now that the wife reminded me what it was," he says, "I'm not very proud of this, but me and her were upstairs and we were hiding under the bed." "Hiding from what?" Of course, I asked. He says, "Well, I'm not sure, but," he says, "whatever it was very low over this house, and the house was shaking and shuddering, and the noise was deafening, and we were terrified." He says, "I knew it wasn't a Sea King or a Labrador or anything like that." He says, "I'm a naval architect for D&D. And get this, Michael, he designed some of the buildings in the Shelburne base."
Oh, wow.
Anyway, so I'm saying, "Yeah." And he says, "Whatever it was, I just, I thought we were going to die." He was just this strong about it. And I'm like, "Uh huh." I said, "Well, how did your name end up in this report?" And he goes, "Well, that's the funniest part about the whole thing, Chris." He said, "All of a sudden," he goes, "there was a knock at the door and the sound just ended. And I heard a knock at the door and I went down and it was the officer." I said, "Yeah." He goes, "He wanted me to step outside. I just leaned a bit and looked out and I saw the neighbors. I wasn't going out. And he invited me out to have a look, but I wouldn't do it." But he said, "That's as much as I know," he said. And it's unfortunate he just listed me as a witness. I said, "Well, you witnessed something." I said, "How do you explain this?" He said, "I cannot. I've just tried to forget it. Um, Good luck with all that." And there it is. And I'll end it there. But, what was that? What
Hmm.
was that? And boy, I wrestled with that for a long time, and it led to a lot of speculation. And over time, it started making sense. And that case is grown to influence a lot of people in terms of opening their mind toward things like the concept of reality transformation and all kinds of other possibilities of how this UFO phenomenon blends into other aspects of the paranormal. So you've heard about it and you've seen that this case has legs now, this cold case. And that's the great thing about your RCMP records, Elliott, that I love, is that the records that you guys kept on the force, these cases that are archived, you know, it's these great cold cases that you can come back at and find so much more out of and learn from. And it's a resource that's unique here in Canada, and it's something I've been able to exploit, I think, to the benefit of a better understanding. And I'd just like to know your thoughts on this.
No, I agree. The reports are very valuable. In fact, in that particular case, Constable Farrand actually wrote down, like you said, his opinion, but he made sure that they knew it was his opinion. But he said, "I might add, it is the opinion
Hmm.
of the writer that there is no possibility
Exactly.
at all what I saw, what might have been a star or even a planet as I was looking through the binoculars, and therefore would have been able to tell the difference." Which is interesting because whoever in the government would review cases often would try and blame planets for the UFO sightings. I'm sure you're familiar with. He policed in Newfoundland his whole career, but he lives in Nova Scotia now. Jim Blackwood, and he
Oh
was
yeah,
part of the big
Jim
Clare,
Blackwood.
the big Clarenville, Newfoundland UFO sighting back in
Yes,
October 12th, 1978. And
exactly.
the government official there, McNamara, tried to say that it was the planet Jupiter or Saturn.
Hmm.
But Blackwwod said that he never even looked at the case file, never looked at any of the paperwork that was submitted with the case file, didn't talk to any of the interviewees or witnesses. He basically made the decision that it was a planet from his chair in
Hmm.
Ottawa. So,
Wasn't wasn't that didn't that case involve like the explosion of an electrical box in the house? Is that that
No,
case?
no, no, no.
Not so much. Okay.
That's the Belle Isle Bang
Oh, that's
off
the Belle
on
Isle
Belle
case.
Isle.
Well,
Yeah.
let's let the audience know a little bit about what the details of the Clarenville case are there, Elliot, if you don't mind.
yeah, sure. So the Clarenville sighting happened, like I said, it was around 3 a.m. on October 12th, 1978. Again, the names are released in the police report, so it's public record. But Chester Lethbridge and his wife reported a UFO sighting near Random Island, Trinity Bay, Newfoundland. They watched the object for about 2 hours with binoculars. The object was hovering around 500 feet. It was circular in shape and about 35 to 40 feet in diameter. They estimated it, and it would flash blue, red, and yellow. And they reported the incident initially to the Department of National Defense. But again, on October 26, 1978, at 1:45 a.m., they reported another UFO sighting, but this time it was to the RCMP, and Constable Jim Blackwwod attended it from the Clarenville RCMP. He too watched the object through binoculars that were 15 times magnification. He watched it for quite a while, just flying overhead. Um, he also uh, had a telescope as well on a tripod. Sorry, that's what it was. It was a telescope on a tripod, not binoculars, with 15
Gotcha.
times magnification. So he was able to see the object really, really well. This object was flashing blue, and it had lights on each side, and they would also have a rapid red and white light in the middle
Oh,
portion
clearly the planet Jupiter.
that were flashing. Yeah, yeah, exactly. Three different
Clearly.
colors, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The undercarriage of the object was illuminated by a light as well, which was interesting. So he watched it for quite a while, and before he made his official report, he did check out the nearest brightest star in the sky with the telescope to make sure that it was different than the object that he was watching, and of course it was. The RCMP in that case actually put him in front of the media, and I think it's still on YouTube. It used to be on his YouTube channel. You can actually watch the
Yeah.
interview, and
Yeah. It's
it
still
was so
there.
old. It was so old that the RCMP patches, I don't think, had the bilingualism on it. It was just the English at the time. But they actually put him in front of the camera to, explain this UFO sighting because the media had caught wind of it and were calling about it. So that's how open, even back in the late 70s that the RCMP were about this. They would put an officer in front of the camera to talk about it. Um, and again, like I said, it was reviewed by a government official in Ottawa, and they determined that it was most likely the planet Jupiter, which has a brilliant light to it, I guess, around mid October. Or Saturn as well is the other explanation that they came up with. But the only problem with that is, like I said, the guy didn't even take the time to review any of the paperwork, talk to any of the witnesses, nothing. He just made the decision from Ottawa. I think back in those days, it was easy for the government to just kind of point the fingers at planets and things like that. Whereas in today's environment, Chris would know more about this. It would probably be a lot more complicated now because back then they didn't have drones and certain things like that. So now your investigation into UFOs would be a lot more complicated than it would be back then. So the older cases I actually like because there would be a lot less light pollution, I guess, for lack of better terms.
Yeah. It
I
was a
have the
golden
video up
age.
here. I have the video up here just while you guys were talking, and it is available on YouTube. And I don't know if Sean's prepared for this, but I'm sure this will be an object of discussion after the show. But I can actually play a little bit of this clip here, and I'm just going to go ahead and do this right now.
Not seeing it, Michael.
Yeah, I just realized that Sean just let us know that. So much for the ad hoc technology.
Okay.
But anyways,
All right.
we'll put a link in the description so people can
Sure.
surf that. Yeah,
Yeah.
Yeah,
there you go. I mean,
yeah, it's
Yeah.
really interesting to see that. You don't see that a whole lot. But I remember talking to Jim about it when I wrote the kind of the paragraph in my book there, and he said he didn't even want to do the media interview, but he was the investigating officer. The media was calling and wanted answers, and they threw him in front of the camera. So
Yeah. And of course, now that case has been commemorated in the release of that special coin, the third one in a series of UFO coins, the other two being the Shag Harbor incident and the Falcon Lake case, with Stefan Mahalik out there in Manitoba. So now, it's commemorated as part of Canadian history too, with that special release coin. But yeah, Jim Blackwood, AKA the Raccoon Whisperer, quite a guy, eh?
okay,
Quite a
whoa.
story.
Back up. You can't drop something like that without giving it context. What do you mean the Raccoon Whisperer?
Well, for years, Jim has been, it began way back when his wife was still alive, who he's lost. But, you know, they would feed the wild animals, would come to the back porch, largely raccoons. Occasionally there'd be a fox or a squirrel or whatever, peanut butter sandwiches, hot dogs, whatever. And eventually he got himself a YouTube channel and has been doing this over years. And I can't remember, it was a year or two ago now. There was one night when he had 25 of them show up, and they're kind of swarming him for seconds and
Oh,
thirds.
that's right. It went
And
viral.
it went viral, and the rest is history, as they say. So
Yeah.
Jim has a couple of claims to fame. He's also a musician, a great keyboardist, and sings the odd tune and that, and quite the well-rounded, kind of a renaissance man in that part of Nova Scotia.
Yeah, my mom and dad were driving from Charlotte. I'm actually here in Charlottetown right now. My mom and dad were driving from Charlottetown, and that would have been, the 1980s. They were driving from Charlottetown to Surrey, so they're heading northeast, and they saw an object hovering in the sky to the north, and the sun was probably overhead to the left, so it was glinting in the light. And as my father described it, RCMP officer, right? He's seen a lot of stuff, 20 years in the force. He's so deadpan about it. It still blows me away how deadpan he was about it. He says, yeah, so we got out of the car and there it was, hovering there. And it was, I said, well, what did it look like, Dad? And he said, well, it was, it looked like a big cigar and it was glinting in the light and it was just sort of swaying. And he said, I knew that was strange. And we just happened to have the binoculars in the car.
Hmm.
And Jan and I were standing outside, and so I got the binoculars, and we watched this thing for 15 minutes. 15 minutes. I said, and it was hovering. He said, well, it was floating around a little bit, but it was more or less stationary. And then he said, I'm trying to remember how that ended. Oh, yeah, that's right. And then two jets came from behind me, which would have been from the south, New Brunswick, or sorry, Nova Scotia, and chased it away. And then I think he went back to eating a sandwich.
How maritime is that? Yeah. Yeah. How do you pay the power bill? Like go in and make a sandwich. Yeah. As one guy said to me, he went in and made a fold over sandwich. I love that. How maritime is
Fault
that?
over
A
sandwich.
fold over sandwich. Yeah. Listen, I'd like to mention another kind of RCMP file. I think that's very interesting because there's something that the RCMP record and files share with military ones that I think, is probably slightly surprising to the public. And it's this, is that often you learn more from margin notes than from the body of text in it. The body of text can be rather dry. And there's a great report. I don't know if you're familiar with this one, Elliot, but there was a UFO report. I'm trying to remember now. I think it was 1978. I don't know if I even have a copy of that one. But what it was that a gentleman, his name was Brian Peveril I think he was from Falmouth, Nova Scotia, just beyond Windsor in the Annapolis Valley, reported to the RCMP that it was something like, I don't know, 5:30 in the morning. He was just driving over that little causeway there where the highway bends by Windsor. And there was one of these three sectioned UFOs, like the reported in the Webster sighting and that Constable Perrin had seen hovering silently over the road there. And he had to drive under it, and he looked behind him and ahead of him, and there was no other traffic, and he was reluctant, and he thought his best course of action was just to speed up and keep going and hope for the best, which is what he did. But what's cool about this little simple, not quite full page report is there's some margin notes written in where one of the officers who was filing it writes in, and this is preserved, within the microfilm record. Several members of the force have reported seeing these things in the early morning hours in the vicinity, sort of thing. And it's like so and so and so and so saw, and it's just great. And I've seen reports like that too, where you'll see details given by RCMP officers that had sightings without a civilian precursor report. And I always find them fascinating. And it's just an insight into how prevalent it was. It's just a question of being in the right place at the right time, So, but those kind of things are so insightful and just so human somehow,
Yeah, it is. I don't recall that particular report, but I do recall one particular report where the word UFO was written in the margin and underlined 3 times.
Yeah,
So like you said, the handwritten notes are really important
yeah,
because obviously whoever wrote that felt that it was important enough to
yeah.
underline it 3 times. So
The
yeah,
one
no,
you're
you're right.
Yeah, the one you're referring to wasn't RCMP. That's an air desk report from headquarters in Ottawa, and it has to do with Shag Harbor. And that big letter and the exclamation mark and the underlining was the writing of Squadron Leader William Bain, who was interviewed in the Chronicle Herald back in the day. I was lucky enough to go to Ottawa and interview him face to face for 3 hours. He reported to
Wow.
me his own UFO sightings, and he was one of the many people that mentioned the master plan. That document that shows the working relationship between RCMP and Canadian Armed Forces and the U.S. forces and everything. And that I worked so hard and was lucky enough in, I think it was 2003, to have released to me by the chief archivist. And
Is
the
this the
tricky and
space
hard
object contingency plan you're
the
talking about?
Space Object Contingency Plan, which has an alternate title, and I can remember. I remember once they decided they were going to release it to me unencumbered, and one of the documents, I don't know if that's one of the ones that Sean has, or we're going to show them. I just showed just some random examples, but they're cool ones because, yeah, like there is an RCMP X file. This is a genuine X file. They
Yeah,
had
you can
such
see
a
it in the
thing.
top right there. There's a file
That's
number
right.
in the right hand box, and there's an X at the end.
The format of these UFO reports back in the day, they were known as HQ 400Q5 forms. And, 67, the first number would be the year. 400 means it's a UFO report. The number would be the 23rd case for that detachment or whatever. And the X means it's a confidential file. Now, technically, there were 6 levels of security then. You had top secret, secret, confidential, restricted, unrestricted. But the most important one is we don't know what you're talking about. That doesn't exist. And they would get the X designation. I managed to find this amongst the Burke Gaffney papers. Nobody had gone back and cleaned out his desk. And years later, nobody much cared, or even, I think, maybe even in the RCMP knew what they meant. But yeah, is there some other ones there, Sean? But yeah, that's one, and that's a great sighting, by the way, off Sandville. Same night as Shag Harbor, but wow. Yeah, there's one here, and this is interesting. You know what's significant about this? Some people might say, well, that doesn't say much. Why is that an X file? And I can tell you why. This is a request from a response is because the Reverend Burke Gaffney had asked that he wanted UFO reports quicker to him. Now, that's really interesting because at the time, when he's interviewed on those same days in the Halifax Chronicle Herald, he denies having any interest in the topic and that people should forget about, completely tries to debunk it. And some of these letters he actually calls and complains that would like to get the reports quicker from RCMP.
Right. This
So
is with
because it
regards
was
to the Shag Harbor UFO incident, correct?
that's right. Yes, and
Yeah.
that and the Cameron sighting that happened 1 week later. That's what these refer to. Just
Yeah.
see what comes up next, Sean. There, give us one. Yeah. Hmm. Well, Sean might be napping. I don't know what's going on. Well, there's another one. Yeah, we can go on. Yeah, Corporal Stoliker. Yeah, again, Sean, another one. That's another X file, of course. This. Well, here is this actually technically is not an RCMP report, but it is. This is about Shag Harbor, and this is from Barrington Passage to the detachment there, right? And would be going to Halifax, the headquarters on Oxford Street there. And this would be sent on to the Rescue Coordination Center and the Canadian Forces headquarters in Ottawa. What this is a PICA document just because they'd sent a requested detachment for details about the sighting. Now, technically, from the RCMP standpoint, this is not a UFO report because remember, all the people that called from from Lori Wickens to the 7 witnesses that night of the Shag Harbor incident, no one reported a UFO. They simply said that they thought an aircraft had gone down or whatever. This is a follow-up PICA-style document just requesting details on, an investigation. But that's why, and there is no HQ 400Q5 form because in that technical preciseness of the RCMP mentality, no one reported a UFO, so hence no UFO report. But in fact, it's about the case. See if we got another one there, Sean. I don't know. I only sent you a few. And
Sure. Yeah,
there.
there's another one. Yeah.
There's the Webster case. There we go. And this is your typical format for them. And this is that great case that was great even if it had stopped there. It's such a solid case with RCMP witnesses on site and in the distance and other cars. And again, you got everybody's name and the addresses and the witnesses. But my follow-up investigation put this one right into the stratosphere and significant. Yeah, see, is there another, Sean, or we shot the bolt
I think
here? I
that
don't know.
might be it.
That
Yeah.
might be it. Well, that's
Yeah.
cool. It gives you an example of how these things were back in the day.
Right.
Well, yeah, they were there. They had their name all over this. So, are we going to
Well, I
go
mean,
into the
I'm
master
just going to
plan?
say it. It hasn't been said here, but I mean, there are X Files, right? There
Oh,
are X
there are
Files,
X Files. There
and they're
certainly are,
Canadian.
and they're
That's pretty
Canadian.
amazing.
And you know what's interesting is one of the ones we saw go by is why are they X Files? Well, in the case of Father Michael Burke Rafferty, they're trying to cover up his role because he was a UFO investigator for the Canadian government through the auspices of the National Research Council. There's the connection. There's where the paycheck would have came from. Okay. Now, there were other reasons why things become, because all the paperwork on Shag Harbor, the main body of the case was always unrestricted from source. That PICA document and all the other communications and follow up, no security level put on it whatsoever. But if you notice that the Sambro sighting, the same night as Shag Harbor, where they report to the Lunenburg detachment, gets the X designation. And this one, boy, took me a while to scratch my head and consider. And what I believe, but has never been confirmed, my belief is the reason that got the X confidential designation is the fact that in the statement of the witness, which is Captain Leo Howard Mersey, who was the captain of a dragger with 18 men, when he reports his UFO sighting, which had radar returns, same night as Shag Harbor, is the statement near the end. And there's where you get into the black box of the case where it says, it is what I saw was like nothing I'd ever seen before, and I watched the military exercises outside Halifax all the time. Perhaps it's like the thing they're looking for down off Barrington Passage, which you mean Shag Harbor, or off Shelburne.
Mm-hmm.
Indicating a second simultaneous search for a UFO. And I interviewed Leo Howard Mersey before he passed, and he confirmed that, and that he was warned to stay away from the naval operation there by the harbor pilot. So
Yeah.
that would be the
Just for
reason
some
for
of
it
the
having.
guests, yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt you there, but just for some of our guests our audience members, you're not familiar. In 1967, an object had crashed into the waters of southwest Nova Scotia town called Shag Harbor. And of course, divers went down to see what had happened, and there were witnesses, and the RCMP was involved. And but there was a second, or is what Chris calls the black box element to the story
Yeah.
of another incident that occurred around the same time in the following days in Shelburne, which is about 30, 40 nautical miles up the coast. And so that's
Mm-hmm.
what Chris is referring
That's
to.
right. Yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, the Shag Harbor incident is certain it happened. It's a matter of history. The case remains open and unsolved, officially so, in our CMP and Canadian Armed Forces files and in any others. The Shelburne aspect, which is only comes from oral evidence given to me directly by the divers of the fleet diving unit that were involved, remains open and controversial and yet to be proven. However, documents like that RCMP document strongly suggest that, in fact, something did happen and there was a second incident near the Shelburne base, which was Canada's most secret base at the time, the Coordination Center for Submarine Detection in the Atlantic. So, that's it. Now, I don't know, um, Elliott, like, are you familiar with the Space Object Contingency Plan or that? Or did it
I,
ever come up in training?
no, it didn't, and I have seen a copy of it. I may have even gotten it from you, and I
Yeah,
may still
probably. Yeah.
I probably still have it in my file cabinet with all my UFO
Yeah.
files, but no, that never came up. They obviously disbanded that at some point because obviously once I joined, I checked the admin manual and the operation manual, which are the two. There's multiple manuals, but those are the two main manuals that police officers would look at. The operation manual has to do with actual operational procedures, and then the administrative manual would have to do with like rates of pay and your administrative type paperwork stuff. And I checked
Yeah.
under both of those, and there was absolutely nothing
Yeah.
withstanding
Yeah.
today about UFOs. Now, if you were to call the police today and report a UFO sighting, they would still attend. But I don't
Yes.
think it's as taken as seriously as it was back then. And like you said, Chris, with that agreement that was in place with DND, I read a few reports that we got through the archives where members would have probably finished their 12-hour shift, were tired, wanted to go home, and they said, I'll deal with the rest of this file when I get back on shift. And when they got back on shift, there was actually supervisor comments in some of the reports where they got in absolute trouble for not reporting it to D&D right away because the policy
Yes.
had said that you're supposed to
That's right.
report it to D&D immediately
That's
so
right.
that they can do their side of it. And there was a few members that tried to fly under the radar and go home, get some sleep, and come back and do it, and they got caught and got in trouble for it. So
Yeah, yeah. I can tell you that the plan existed and it was often enforced, and it came up in the Shag Harbor incident we referred to. I knew that the men, even back in the day, didn't have specific training, right? But what would happen is when such an incident would come up, the provincial HQ, so Oxford Street, would check with Ottawa and they would refer to the manual there as to how to proceed. They would liaise with them, and that's how it was carried out. Um, and I believe nowadays that in the Shag Harbor incident there was a violation of the act too, which is why the Coast Guard found an artifact and turned it over to U.S. forces, because that wasn't how it was supposed to happen. The Coast Guard and the Life Saving Service was new then; it had only come about in '66. They may not even been aware of this plan. But I know when the plan was released, it was a lucky break that I'd found a file number from a corporal while checking on an RCMP sighting case I couldn't find, that allowed eventually to me to negotiate the release of the policy from the archivist at the time, which I think was Sergeant Maurice Laferriere. And it was really cool because he told me that it would have to work outside of the Access Act because we wouldn't have time under the provisions. You have 30 days. I could have asked for a 15-day extension, and he explained it would take longer than that because he needed the permission from every provincial capital, from Ottawa, and from Washington, because it displayed our working relationship on these matters with foreign powers.
mm,
And that may sound a bit highfalutin or hard to believe, but not too many years later, there was a crash of Cosmos 954, a Soviet nuclear satellite in the high Canadian Arctic, right? And these plans were all brought up because this would, dictate who was in charge, on the scene, and how we would liaise with U.S. forces, and they assisted us in that search and the cleanup. Um, and because of that, and because of Skylab that was going to come in a few years later, the space object plan was revised. It probably has a new name now. But the thing is, for years, Don Ledger, myself, Chris Rakowski, and other researchers, we kept hearing about this, because officers would tell us about a case and they'd say, well, you'd say, why did you do that? Well, we called headquarters and they checked with Ottawa and the space object plan said this. The most ironic thing I can remember, it was kind of an embarrassment to the chief archivist at the time when I finally negotiated the release of this. And it came to me, he said, Chris, I wouldn't read too much into it, but there's an alternate title here. I don't know who picks these things. And when I said, what's the alternate title? He said, the master plan. We both broke out laughing. I said, well, that is unfortunate. I'm not going to fan that flame, but it was kind of cute, you know.
It's quite interesting. And, I was just thinking in my quippy way that, now they can add another reason for unexplained phenomenon because COVID.
Well, yeah,
Just blame it on
you know,
COVID. Yeah.
everybody
So
blames everything else.
that's right. Elliott, the big elephant in the room in my mind is what about yourself when you were on duty with the force? Did you ever have to attend a UFO sighting or some sort of a high strangeness event, and then therefore have to file something?
No, it's funny. I've been asked that a few times, and I've never witnessed anything supernatural or paranormal or UFO wise while I was on duty. Now, when I was posted to Yellowknife, Northwest Territories, there was a UFO sighting up in a little community called Delaney, Northwest Territories, and this UFO sighting lasted for at least 2.5 hours. And it's in I wrote the story in my book that's coming out next week, actually, because I got to speak to one of the investigators. I was up there when that happened, and I remember them flying the RCMP members from Delaney the next morning to Yellowknife headquarters to fully debrief them in person. And I found out through talking to the member, and he's allowed me to use his name, but Kirk Hughes. He said that actually CSIS got involved after the fact as well, that they had sent a CSIS agent up to kind of review their work and their file on it. And this was an interesting case because one of the Kirk was a constable at the time, but they had another corporal there. So the detachment's very small. It usually consists of a corporal and two constables, a three-man posting for roughly a 450, 500 people community. And the corporal that was there, he was actually used to be an air traffic controller. So that was really interesting. And then the junior constable that was there was a semi-professional photographer. So it was really cool to kind of have all their perspective there. But they
What did they
actually, in these,
see?
so what they ended up seeing is they got a call because after certain hours you're put on call. There's not 24-hour policing in small communities, so they ended up receiving a call, and they were told that there was the dispatcher didn't even know how to say it, so she basically just blurted out and said, like, listen, we've got basically a UFO call here, and somebody is claiming that there's like a laser beam shooting down from this UFO. And of course the constable thought it was a joke, but when he opened his window he actually saw the object, and it actually did have some sort of light emanating from the bottom of it. And the best way that they described it was that it looked like a laser beam. So he started his investigation. Of course, he took out his notebook and started, taking notes, and went out to look at the object. He did a lot of research on it. He went in, he checked where the satellites were. There were certain websites that existed, like Heavens Above
Heavens
dot
above,
com
yeah.
was another website that Chris Stiles had put me onto many years ago. So he checked a few different websites. There was no satellites in the area. He called Yellowknife International, or Yellowknife Airport. It's not an international airport. Yellowknife Airport. They had nothing on radar. They asked them to check with Edmonton International Airport. They had nothing on radar. There was a thunderstorm, but it was further south and it wasn't affecting the community. They ended up having radio issues. The radio died on them. The TV went out. The internet went out in the community. They believe that the object may have been affecting the services there. They actually tried to use the satellite phone, and even the satellite phone was having trouble connecting to the satellites. And they blame that the object may have been responsible for that.
So there
The
were enough witnesses there. There were enough witnesses
Yeah.
there, and official witnesses that would prompt bringing in the Canadian Security Intelligence Service,
Yeah.
CSIS.
Well, you
What's
had
the
three police officers, and then you had pretty much the whole town, because the whole town came out to look at this object, and they thought it was like, some of them thought it was like an alien UFO. Some of them thought it was like a bad omen. Some of them thought it had like a religious meaning to it. So the whole town was obviously stirred up by this
what
UFO sighting.
what's the date of the event, Elliot? You know?
Yeah, it happened on I'm just September 6th of 2011, actually.
Oh, so it's fairly recent.
And
Okay.
I had heard about it, and I think I may have because, like I said, I was posted to Yellowknife when it happened. I remember them flying the members in the next day to headquarters to
Mm.
debrief them. I believe I told the Canadian UFO survey about it. So if they should have a UFO report from 2011, I do believe I told them about it.
Yeah.
And I
Um,
guess CSIS would have some sort of a report too, the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, right?
they,
Basically, our Canadian version of the CIA, right?
Exactly. They should have one because apparently they flew up. NORAD was also involved because they were talking after they checked all the airport radars. They ended up talking
Mm.
to NORAD, and after a couple of hours, they actually sent two Canadian fighter jets up to try and intercept this object, and that's when the object disappeared because the members were on the phone with NORAD, and NORAD said we should have two fighter jets approaching the object very shortly,
Mm.
and that's when the officers actually saw and could hear the fighter jets. Obviously, the
What?
object itself didn't make any noise or anything like that while they were
What?
watching it.
Elliot, what's the name of the small community near Yellowknife? I think I've just found my next paper chase here.
It's called Deline, Northwest Territories, and it's spelled
Mm-hmm.
Deline.
Okay.
There's another UFO sighting from Deline, but it's not this particular one on YouTube. I believe somebody has a video of a Deline UFO sighting, but it's not this particular one. This one happened
Right.
September 6, 2011.
Mm-hmm. Got it.
What I could do, actually, Chris, if you're interested too, I can send you the section from my book on that. I could just convert it to PDF and I can send it to you.
Which book is that, Elliot?
What if?
Of your
That's
three?
Yeah.
that's going to be the one coming out next week. More
Yeah.
supernatural encounters from law enforcement.
Yeah. Yeah. I'd
Great.
appreciate that very much. I'll probably buy the book, but in the meantime, yes,
Yeah, for
I'd
sure. Yeah,
appreciate that to get a
yeah. I'll
start
send
on
it.
it.
Yeah, I'll send it
And
to you. I can send it
listen,
to you too, Mike, if you want.
Oh,
yeah,
yeah, it'd be fascinating to read that.
yeah.
Yeah.
I'd like to take this opportunity too to remind you, Elliot, that COVID willing, and that next year, if in Yarmouth we have that Shag Harbor UFO Expo we've been hoping to have, that you were free to attend anything there, of course, for the help you gave us a few years back just before COVID for the coin release down there when you showed up presented for us. So, and any follow up information, if we're not in touch for a while, will be available on that website about that big conference. And we still got all the original speakers and events planned. And you can find that anytime at shagharborUFOexpo.com.
Yeah, and
Okay.
just to
Awesome.
recap here, of the three books, number three is coming out soon. So the first book, Evil, that's right, the first book, Evil and Exeter. This is
Yep.
interesting. I'll just read you folks the back here. Ever since she was a little girl, Haley has been surrounded by ghosts. As she grew older, she began to realize that no matter where she moved or what place she lived in, the spirits would seemingly follow her. Their presence and mischievous behavior had never been problematic until she began to realize that something more sinister was at work. Folks, read this book because it's written by a trained RCMP, Royal Canadian Mounted Police Mountie investigator. All right, and there's a photograph, I believe, of her right on the back. Correct, Elliot?
Yeah, that's her. Yeah, yeah.
Right. So the true story of an investigation into one family's terrifying haunting where evil has no conscience. I love that subtitle. And then the second book, Supernatural Encounters, True Paranormal Accounts from Law Enforcement. And of course, the third book takes the stories even further, correct?
That's right. Yeah, it basically picks off right where Supernatural Encounters left off.
Well, listen, this has been a fascinating show. It's great to get into.
Fantastic.
Yeah, like really nice to have you on,
Yeah.
and it's great for the audience members to get a perspective from a police officer. So thank you so much, Elliot,
Yeah.
for coming on the show, and you've prompted Chris to take his bulldog talons onto yet a new paper chase with
Yeah.
Ottawa. We will definitely will be following up on that, right,
He
Chris?
was known as Fox Mulder. Stanton used to call me the Bulldog.
That's right.
That's right. Yeah, yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, in my
Yep.
film, actually.
It's a pleasure,
He's a
guy.
bulldog. Yeah. So thank you very much, Elliot, and folks out there. I hope you enjoyed this show, and as always, like and subscribe and share the love with everybody around the world. And it's Mike McDonald here and Chris Dials with Elliott Van Dusen for yet another completed episode of FSUFO. See